First off, thank you all for coming. We're really excited about this event. It's a long story that we won't get into right now, but we've been working on developing this for about a year. I see one of our speakers, Ben, laughing at that, so you know it's genuine. We're really excited to bring this program to you, and also one of the good things that happened in the last year is we partnered with the DER Task Force, which is a great organization that's where Duncan's going to say a few words about them. But they partnered with us to bring you this event. And I just want to say on behalf of young professionals in energy, super excited to kick this off. I don't want to waste a lot of time because we only have an hour for this. But if you're not one of our members already and you like what you heard, please go to our website and sign up. It's www.ypenergy.org. And with that, I'll turn it over to Duncan. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming out. Yeah, likewise, it's been not quite a year for us planning this one. We jumped in a little later, but it's been nice to get everybody together here. Awesome panel, awesome moderator, and also just kind of exciting to bring these two little communities together. So today, Elta Colo from Wood Mackenzie is going to be leading this panel discussion on DERMS. And Elta, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Duncan. Where did we decide on sharing a presentation here? Are you doing it for me?
I'll share it now.
Great. So while Duncan does that, so just a brief intro for myself. The content lead for our Grid Edge research practice at Wood Mackenzie Power and Renewables. So, you know, what we mean when we say Grid Edge is really thinking distribution down and behind the meter. So that's kind of the focus area for our research, and essentially kind of layering on technologies, business models, policies, and regulations that are kind of governing the evolution of the distributed space, right? Both for the utilities, very much so is where we're focused, but increasingly so on the customer side. So, you know, this is a discussion on achieving carbon neutrality with DERs. And a big part of that is actually the orchestration of distributed energy resources. And one of the things that always comes up in these discussions is, you know, DERMS, distributed energy resource management systems. And we get into these wonky discussions about, you know, what DERMS is, or however you want to say it. So I just thought I'd give a little bit of our definition that we've used over the years that has been pretty well accepted by the industry. So Duncan, can you just go to the next slide, please?
Definitely.
Thanks so much. So when we look at DERMS, the context that we look at the software solutions is looking at the DR lifecycle management. And if we look at it from kind of a utility perspective, it's really thinking about kind of starting with the assets themselves, registering them, and going all the way towards, you know, the billing and the maintenance of the assets themselves. So DERMS software players can play kind of across this process of the lifecycle management, or actually kind of have a plug and play approach. So I think that's a key thing to keep in mind, that not all vendors do all of these things, but what very often is the case is that it's a plug and play approach. And what we're seeing for utilities is that there isn't kind of one DERM solution to rule all DERs. Utilities are actually increasingly contracting with 2, sometimes even more than 2 DERMS providers, depending on the types of DERs in their system, the volume of DERs, and, you know, kind of their increasing needs for managing the distribution system, and also increasingly so looking at the wholesale market participation, especially with kind of the recent policy movements. So just kind of to lay that foundation. Can you go to the next slide, please? I think traditionally, we've thought of DERMS as just being a utility tool, and that is kind of where the concept was born. But what I want to show here is actually the fact that the DERMS buyers with the technology, yes, you know, started off and will be a big market for utilities, but increasingly so, we're seeing the software becoming important for competitive retailers, aggregators, and CNI customers themselves, or entities that service the CNI customer base. So that's something to keep in mind, because if you get enough volume behind the meter, you're going to need to orchestrate that and hopefully, you know, bid it into grid services programs, wholesale markets, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to give that view that Active. And then we kind of delineate the vendors in terms of fleet, edge, and central. So again, boundaries that we've drawn, but vendors spill over into kind of the three areas. So when we talk about central DERMS, it's really thinking about a DER desk and utility operation. So think about, the integration with a distribution management system, and in an ideal situation, distribution management system, which is, a multi-year process for a utility. So that's kind of where you get the most complexity in terms of kind of the integration and the deployment for utilities. The next kind of use case that we see is edge DERMS, as we call it. And this is essentially kind of thinking about controlling DERs for advanced grid services. So, think regulation, for instance, and kind of that individual control of the assets to service those needs. And again, you may have a touch point with operations, but not direct integration with the DMS. And then kind of the fleet DERM solutions is what we think about when we think about kind of the virtual power plants or kind of advanced demand response type programs. Again, broad definitions here, but this is kind of how we have delineated the space. And there are vendors that do all three, and there are those that specialize in each one of these as well. So kind of with that context, right? We've been living in a year where I think a lot of eyes are on utilities, a lot of eyes are on our industry. So I'm going to ask my panel essentially at this time, as we kind of close 2020, one, to introduce themselves, and two, how have the events of 2020 reshaped the drivers for the adoption of DERs? And I'm going to start with David here because you're closer to the customer.
Awesome. Thank you, Alta, for that introduction. So David Acchiardi with Blueprint Power. I'm heading the energy systems team at Blueprint, where we are trying to connect those real estate edge customers that are seeking to innovate with the addition of DERs to energy markets. Those are retail and wholesale markets directly. So touch on a lot of the different aspects of the life cycle of DERMS, but primarily on that pricing, market signal, and the optimization blocks are key components of Blueprint's offering in deploying more DERs and connecting them to these opportunities. My background is in techno-economic analysis, so answering questions around sizing and the dispatch of individual resources such as batteries and cogen systems, for example, but also on more longer term assets such as electric trains and factory systems that hopefully will make their way into more organized DERMS platforms. In terms of the question of how has COVID really shaped the deployment of these assets, we have found that our customers are now seeing DERs as an attractive option. So family state portfolios, REITs that are looking into DERs and now realize that they're a good way of diversifying their portfolio in changing times. Those investments, as flexible as they are in times of uncertainty, become even more valuable. So that's the framing that we're providing for them. We also have realized that the ability of shutting down loads and revising features within their capacity commitments are becoming very valuable components of the offering. So we're very excited of what that next phase of analysis that includes reviews of extreme circumstances, such as the one that we're facing right now, become part of the standard practice for deploying DERs.
Great, thanks so much, David. Ben, let's hear a little bit from you on the orchestration side.
Sure, thanks, Alta. Hi, my name is Ben Ullman. I'm product manager for Transactive Energy at Opus One Solutions. And what Opus One Solutions is a software engineering firm that works with distribution utilities to help them plan for the impact of DER on their grids, and then operate markets to coordinate the behavior of those resources in ways very similar to the wholesale markets in the US, Canada, Australia, UK, and Europe. And then finally, once those resources are coordinated, pass signals directly to them to essentially realize the actions requested by the market. So as product manager for Transactive Energy, what I do is I work with our distribution utility customers to develop these programs and pilot projects to show them where the next steps might be for orchestrating DER behavior along some goal. That goal might be something as advanced as a security-constrained economic dispatch to minimize PV curtailment, or it might be something much more close to now, that would be something closer to an advanced demand response program where the utility is able to select, for example, a resource and request from it based on its availability, some quantity of energy supplied or some quantity of energy reduced in some time frame, a day ahead or intraday. And so what we're doing is saying these wholesale markets exist. A lot of these concepts work very well for coordinating resources at the bulk level. How many of these concepts can be brought down to the distribution level? Our projects include one with SCE, where we're optimizing solar and BESS to essentially minimize cost using the SCE network model. They include another one with ComEd, where we are simulating DER behavior on on a microgrid they own and operate, as well as one with ISO and 3 utilities up in Canada, and a just announced one with Scottish and Southern Energy, where they're looking at creating a marketplace for peer-to-peer transactions between retailers, as well as peer-to-network transactions between those retailers and the distribution utility to, again, allow the utility to safely operate its grid in light of all the DER that are joining. So it's very much saying DER are here, they're likely here to stay. Currently, we can probably accommodate most of their behavior because we plan for worst case. But going forward, if we're not going to be operating under planning for worst case, but instead have to dynamically evaluate what these DER can do and thus should do in an operational time frame, how do we create a program and the system to do that? And that's very much the work that we do with utilities, which is maybe a good segue to our next panelist.
Yep. Stephen, let's hear from you.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me. My name is Steve Malena. I'm the Distributed System Platform Program Manager at Con Edison. And really what my team and I focus on is really thinking through and executing on what the evolution of the distribution system is going to look like in terms of, operational technologies on the grid, information technologies, the tools that we use to plan and operate the system. How are those tools going to change? How do they need to evolve and adapt to more and more DER integration, where we'll be in a future where there are more DER assets than utility assets. And one thing that I will say is that for the purposes of this discussion, what I'll be discussing are really my own personal views and not necessarily the views of Con Edison. I'm looking forward to a great, healthy discussion. And as it relates to really what 2020 has meant for DER adoption, I think really at a macro level, the recent FERC order 2222 was pretty substantial. And I think even more substantial is really the recent election results, right? So think about, what new president of the U.S. Will look like for this clean energy industry, what this means for the U.S.'s leadership as a global steward, particularly in clean energy, and potentially what that means for utilities across the country as it relates to any potential federal funding to accelerate some of DER technology adoption. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what the next couple of years look like.
Great. Yeah, we're all excited about that too. Stephen, I'm going to actually stick with you because we're still on this kind of DERMS topic. And I know we discussed this in our prep call. Can you just kind of give us the reality of, where Con Ed is with kind of the DRMS and DERMS journey, DRMS meaning the demand response management system, right? Because I think that's kind of where the foundation for this was all laid as we're looking to kind of form these aggregations of resources. So just to kind of bring it to reality of where we're at right now, essentially.
Yeah, sure. I think that, so I guess I'll start with sort of the business case, which I think is really when you speak to a lot of utilities, that's obviously one of the key drivers. And I think that, Con Ed's approach relative to DRMS and DERMS has been kind of bespoke. And what I mean by that is that we had a really sort of urgent business need for managing our demand response programs, which have grown to be pretty robust. And, we are in the process of we've recently deployed a new demand response management system. And, that's working well. And we are working to learn from that deployment and see what potential lessons learned can be incorporated into a DERMS implementation. And as far as DERMS goes, you know, back in 2017, we did a lot of work to really think about, you know, a couple things. Really, one, you know, what does DERMS mean for us as a company? Two, what does sort of the vendor landscape look like in terms of DERMS solutions offerings? And three, you know, for peer utilities that are similar in size, you know, how are those utilities thinking about DERMS? And some of the major findings were that, and, you know, and again, this is going back to 2017. So, you know, I fully appreciate that the technology has certainly has gone through a maturation process and will continue to do so over the next few years. But at the time, some of the major learnings we found were that, you know, really a lot of, and we benchmark with, you know, PG&E, SDE, SDG&E, APS, Pacific Gas and Electric. And one of our learnings was that really, you know, I'm sure that for a lot of folks, it's been sort of the same, that, you know, depending on, you know, where you are as a utility, you're going to have your own definition of what DERMS is. And I think that that's largely predicated on the fact that, you know, each utility is looking at their tech stack as it relates to your asset management system, operation systems, planning tools, load flow, connectivity, visualization. So it's your customer information system. So it's sort of the compendium of all of those technologies that you have to really take a hard look at and say, okay, well, if I want to implement a technology that's going to give me visibility into assets that I don't own under a myriad of operational conditions, you know, really, what does that look like? And that's sort of the approach that we wanted to take as far as DERMS goes. And at the time, you know, we learned that back then it was sort of an environment where your traditional large ADMS providers partnered with some DRMS companies to deliver DERMS functionality. And that was back then, obviously. I think that that's matured a little bit, and I think it's at a better place. You know, as far as, you know, some of the work that we've been doing at Con Ed, specifically on DERMS, is, you know, we recognize that our tech stack is evolving, and that there are a lot of legacy systems that are instrumental to DERMS functionality. And so we started off with really sort of a proof of concept approach, where, you know, we took a geographic area in our service territory that has essentially every distribution system topology that you can imagine. So low voltage mesh network, primary auto loops, radial systems, 4 kV auto grids, I mean, you name it. And, you know, we started out by focusing on the core components, which is really your connectivity model and load flow, and then started thinking about, okay, well, what DER assets do we have in this space? Let's bake them in. Let's see what the results are. Can we come up with a solar forecast under partly cloudy, sunny days? What does that look like? How valid is that data? Can that be used to actually put together a solar forecast a week in advance, so to speak? And we learned a lot through that proof of concept. One of the main learnings was interoperability is key, because when you're talking about so many systems that you have to pull data from in order to make decisions and really understand what DER is doing under a variety of operational situations, that interoperability is key. So I'll pause right there, Elta, because I know I sort of gave a mouthful.
No worries. No, it's a lot of really great stuff. I actually, you know, just hearing kind of how complex the process is, even, you know, a few years out from your initial assessment. Ben, I actually want to kick it to you as to, you know, how you're seeing the journey for the utilities that you're talking to, because I think what I've seen, you know, you talked about 2017, that's when we did our first like big DERMS report. And what we saw kind of in our latest round of interviews that we did is that, you know, we've seen the deployment timelines decrease as utilities are getting more comfortable and have increasing needs. So Ben, just let's hear a little bit from you on that.
Yeah, so what I see a lot of is a lot of pilot projects, as Stephen was alluding to, that are very much focused on helping the utilities understand where their next technology investments have to be made to allow them to go to business as usual with these programs. So the first step is a decision on, are these programs the ones that we want to implement? Will they serve our customers? Will they allow us to essentially reliably serve our customers at a cost that is reasonable, right? So the just and reasonable mandate that FERC has for wholesale exists in many ways for the distribution utility as well. And reliability is, of course, its #1 concern. And so the first stage is those projects saying, is this something that can feasibly be done? Okay, great. Now that we've established this is feasible and economically beneficial, so it passes a cost-benefit analysis, what is the way to do that? What are the technology systems we have to procure? And so as Stephen mentioned, there's the connectivity model for Opus 1. That's the basis of all analysis, as it all starts with that low voltage network model down up to medium voltage and performing load flow analyses on that. Okay, so load flow analyses traditionally had been done in planning timeframes. So it didn't much matter if it took you an hour to run a load flow, let's say. However, as more DER connect, those load flows have to be run more frequently. If you want to operate a market, those load flows don't just have to be run more frequently, they have to be run in a time frame that allows you to operate a market. So potentially within a half hour for all circuits that are participating in a market for a day ahead analysis, potentially within a minute for all circuits participating in the same market for an intraday analysis. And then you also have to have a system to communicate that, that schedule generated for the resource, or that operating envelope generated to the resource, which is like, this is your maximum ability to participate and your minimum safe ability to stop participating, let's say. You have to have a system to communicate that to the asset reliably. And the real question is, what do those technology platforms look like software-wise? And what do they look like from as far as hardware goes? Because you don't want to have hardware that's so expensive that all of a sudden the DER is no longer economical. So you don't want to design a system that says, okay, great, we'll have 4-second dispatch, we'll have all of this instantaneous control that then makes it so that the solar panel is no longer affordable, because then you've just blown up your entire use case. And so a lot of it is focusing on what is technology that's workable, we'll keep this affordable so that, yes, the DER will actually exist. This isn't some imaginary DER that will never exist. And that's a lot of what we've seen is questions around what are the technologies and how do these pilot projects help us understand how to improve them? So load forecasting is a big one. Connectivity model updated dynamically is another big one. Generation forecast, completely related to the load forecast, are another one. And then the other ones are the platforms such as Opus 1's or potentially David's that aggregate all of the bids and offers from those resources and then process those bids and offers. And then in 5, 10, 15 years, however long it ever takes, eventually integrate those DER willingness to participate or bids and offers with what the ISOs are doing.
Yeah, that's a fantastic segue here, and I completely agree. And a lot of legwork has been done, I would say, in the last 5 years or so for the demonstration and pilot phases, and really now we're starting to see full deployments, for entire programs that are growing. So, David, what I want to hear a little bit from you, and we had a little bit of this discussion as we were prepping, is kind of the reality of right now where, if we talk about demand response, which is kind of the largest flexible resource that we have, it's still phone calls. So how do we get from, the phone call environment that people are very comfortable with right now towards more automation?
Definitely, you can get started there. So Blueprint side is of seeking participation as soon as possible. A lot of Ben's notes are on future vision for how these retail markets could operate with more dynamic and active control of the resources. We're seeing that demand response was and is the key market participation opportunity that folks have been comfortable with these phone calls and that we would ideally automate. So finding solutions, so developing operating procedures that operators of buildings are comfortable with their existing equipment or with minimal investment in automation technologies that shift them closer to a solution that gets to faster, more optimized bids and schedules for participation is a key part of Blueprint's offering. And as more market revenue opportunities emerge, where the DERMS platforms become available to orchestrate more of the participation of these assets, Blueprint slowly shifts those resources into those platforms. That's the general takeaway here. And to give some examples of how that automation can take place, it's in the form of automated emails, text messages, forms that tie into the existing systems of those operators. However, a lot of the conversation for this panel that I think is very exciting with respect to the current status of the building environment in New York City is with legacy technology that may enable faster adoption of resources to connect to these market opportunities. So one of those key features is the amount of backup emergency generators and cogen systems that already exist in buildings that are seeking or that are not necessarily fully aligned with the decarbonization goals of the cities as well as of the individual real estate owners. And we're seeing that the interconnection process for those resources has actually enabled additional capacity that can be leveraged in terms of space in the sites, as well as in terms of the electrical distribution of those buildings to adopt new technologies, such as storage, very specifically here. And the interplay of those resources with the markets is the part that we're very excited at Blueprint to see more active participation of behind the meter resources at scale, with platforms that provide the true, or that are issuing the true price signals that reflect the value of those behind the meter resources.
Yeah, Stephen, I see you kind of nodding your head here. Do you want to say something about kind of the case for New York City specifically, where David is playing in? You're still muted.
Sorry about that. No, I'm nodding my head because I think that David and Ben brought up excellent points. The way that, and I guess just to kind of pick up on sort of the DERMS topic and proof of concept, there's obviously different ways to deploy your tech depending on what your business needs are, and since we've conducted the proof of concept, we've thought about DERMS as a more sort of a modular approach, instead of sort of trying to go with one large vendor's, for example, DERMS solution that has all the bells and whistles and everything. Really more focused on, what's the use case that we're trying to solve for, who's best in class for that specific use case, and can we deploy that module with interoperability with the rest of our tech stack, and then how do we continue to build that out over time. So to many of the points that David mentioned, particularly here in the city, I think that, over time, we're definitely going to be accelerating in that space on those use cases. Excuse me.
No problem. That you can ask questions here, so just put them in the chat and I'll try to incorporate them. We left 15 minutes in the end for that, but just a friendly reminder here. Another thing that I want to bring up here, right, we're still talking about New York City, so I'm just going to focus in on that. David, is the wholesale market piece here as a value stream for customers, and kind of the wholesale plus kind of the retail portion of it, because I think that's kind of a key space that we're still trying to figure out. So maybe a little bit on kind of the value for your customers in that.
Yeah, definitely. So a big chunk of the compensation that we see for behind the meter resources comes from retail value streams that already exist and that are incorporated into demand response programs, demand charges. That's key elements of what a resource would provide as a behind the meter one. But on the wholesale market side, there are opportunities around providing reserves, frequency regulation, and capacity compensation, which determines both supply and delivery capacities that you need to incorporate into the load forecasting and the actual billing. And those are really the core elements of what these behind the meter resources can provide, is flexibility during reliability constraint conditions at the wholesale level that might not be already compensated from retail programs. Those are the general revenue streams that we see being bridged in from wholesale markets.
Great. You know, Ben, one of the things that I want to touch on with you is kind of the your role in integrated resource planning, and also increasingly so as we're seeing distribution play a role in kind of, if we look at integrated utilities. So I think that's kind of an interesting piece of one of the things that you're doing.
Sure. So when we say integrated resource planning, what I interpret that as is looking at a distribution utility that has various DER in its service territory and is potentially looking to new DER as a way to resolve constraints that it sees coming up in a year. And then manage those DER in an operational time frame to resolve that constraint as was planned. So what Opus One does is it works with utilities, ingests a connectivity model, ingests a long-term load forecast or a series of them to do scenario analyses, ingests a series of generation forecasts related to the DER that the utility may see installed in its system, and then performs various power flow analyses and hosting capacity analyses to determine what sorts of upgrades are necessary for the system, or, and this is where it becomes really interesting, whether those DER could be controlled in some way such that you don't have to upgrade the system to host them. However, that question becomes very much a regulatory one of, is the utility allowed to plan based on controlling those resources or not? Is the utility mandated to plan based on controlling those resources or not? Now, if that does take place, if that latter utility planning based on controlling resources takes place, what all of a sudden potentially gets opened up is another value stream. And that value stream is a distribution capacity value. So the wholesale payments that David was speaking about, there's basically two of them. There's the energy type payments, and then there's the capacity type payments. The capacity ones are availability ahead of time. The energy ones are, the contracted output a day ahead or intraday. Bill reductions can be kilowatt hour or kilowatt, and that's kind of what those two speak to. But the same concept exists in the distribution system, where potentially the reliability event could be some sort of a peak event at both a distribution feeder and at the bulk system. And so these DER could be used to offset the need to, for example, run through a bulk constraint event, and also reduce the need to overload a circuit or overload a substation. And so to the extent that they're creating value there, there's potential for passing value to them. That was kind of the basis of the New York LMP plus D model that was trialed with Opus One National Grid, I'd say like 2017, 2018-ish. And that model is still discussed actively in the sense that what is the distribution value, what is the value that could be passed to a DER for a distribution capacity? Those questions are not really answered anywhere as far as I've seen, but they're still open questions that are being discussed. And answering those questions determines what integrated distribution planning looks like.
For sure, and I think one of kind of the use cases that, one of the questions that we see here is, can you defer transmission distribution investments with utilizing a DERMS type technology to orchestrate resources? So,
yep.
Maybe a little bit on your experience with that, and actually want to hear from Conrad's experience.
Sure. So our experience is that yes, utilities have asked us to do those sorts of studies. Those sorts of studies would be hosting capacity studies or optimal power flow based studies, where the utility says, this is my load profile for a year, or this is my load profile for a representative day in which I'd want to be able to use DER to resolve a constraint. And then if I have this scenario, like scenarios A, B, and C, and A, B, and C are defined by different quantities of DER or different types of DER. Is there a control strategy for scenarios A, B, or C that lets me not overload my my circuit or not overload my substation, or to your point, maybe extend the life of that asset? because I'm not running it through its useful life by, for example, loading it to 120% of its rating. So those studies are being requested, yes. And the question is, are those going to become business as usual? Because right now they're very much in the, what would it look like to do that study? And then the question becomes, okay, we've done the study. We think that DER could be used in this way. We have to believe that the DER could be controlled this way in an operational time frame. And what that means is load forecast and generation forecasts that are reliable, connectivity models that are reliable, and communication systems that are reliable. And so the first question is answering, is this something that's useful? I think the answer is getting closer to a yes on that. That is to say, controlling these DER to resolve some predefined constraint. And then the next question is, how do you coordinate all the DER through some sort of a platform at the utility or elsewhere to realize the service that you expect of the resource? That is to say, I'm going to pay the resource to exist to perform some function. Now I have to be able to call on it based on the payment that I've contracted with the resource.
Yeah, I'm wondering here actually, David, as one of the providers of these resources, you know, sorry, I just kind of lost my voice there. You know, what are kind of some of the challenges that you're seeing as, you know, you're looking to integrate into that model?
Yeah, so some of the challenges here are with respect to dynamic hosting capacities, having an interconnection process that is clear and a metering strategy that fully exposes the value of those resources. That said, the customer or the investor's main issue is with respect to having clear perspective on the market revenues that will be forecasted and understanding the risk component associated with them. Those are primarily regulatory and capacity risks that we, from an advisory services perspective, tackle directly. But the effort around decarbonization in New York City, in particular, just to bring it back down to what we've been focused on in this panel, is one where guidance around compliance with Local Law 97 or avoided penalties has provided some form of certainty in our revenue stream on that side. That has really helped in understanding what is a better timeline for the deployment in a portfolio. And as well as what can be done across a series of buildings in that same portfolio. So hopefully that gets us closer to the answer of how to participate with clear market signals that are evolving. There's always a risk component to these, and providing investors with the opportunity to understand high, medium, low case, and a timeline has been a key component of our solution to that question.
Yeah, you mentioned exposing the value, right? And metering is a big part of that. So, you know, can you just talk us through a little bit, you know, advanced metering infrastructure and kind of the value that plays into this? Because it is key, and I think we forget that it is kind of a foundational technology as part of, you know, good modernization and exposing the value of DERs.
Definitely. So for some of our customers, they've never been exposed to their energy use and where it goes, even for large portfolios. And there are sophisticated energy teams within large REITs and family real estate portfolios are very much aware of what opportunities they have and have a horizon of investments that they would like to make. But detailed analysis around how they're shifting gas consumption towards electricity can get murkier with respect to their individual building systems. And in many cases, we're finding that the monitoring systems for these building systems might not be as integrated with their electric metering, their gas metering, their C metering. So having a comprehensive viewpoint of all of those services and their building equipment is a space that Blueprint is in. And has been very helpful in guiding conversations around decarbonization. And so that's one of the elements that I would respond to that question. In terms of deployment of AMI, I think that's definitely more on Steve's ballpark into how that looks like in New York City and what is the level of access that customers have. But we found that there is definitely a need for more digestible data visualization from the building's perspective beyond just the utility data. And that is where a company like Blueprint really fits in integrating all the different data platforms that the building may have.
Great. I actually want to hear from Stephen here on, where Con Ed is on its AMI journey, because I think that's important here as we're talking about New York.
Yeah, sure. Right now, the company's, I'd say maybe 3/4 of the way completed with the AMI deployment in our service territory. And looks like we'll be fully complete with the program, I believe, end of next year or partially into Q1, Q2 2022. And, it's AMI has been a tremendous and we expect it to bring tremendous value for us from a planning perspective, operationally, as well as really, understanding our customers' energy usage better, so that we can partner them or put them in touch with service providers that will provide services that extend beyond really what Con Edison does in terms of energy service companies and so forth. So overall, I think it's a positive program. In terms of the data aspect, there's sort of, I guess, when you think about some of the AMI data and trying to use it for operational purposes, it's I haven't encountered too many other peer utilities that have been using that data in sort of real-time operations, because it's really, when you're looking at a geographic area, it's just a tsunami of data to be able to process, to be able to make sort of real-time decisions. So definitely looking forward to more value that we're going to be able to extract out of all the data that we get over time once we're done with the deployment.
Yeah. And I'd like to add something to what we're all just discussing here with AMI data. Is it's crucial for like these live operational systems to have reliable data at the resource end. So like the work that Con Ed is doing, to the extent that that data is live and reliable, that's probably steps ahead of a lot of other places in the country, if not the world. And one example of why that's so important is, let's say that you want to optimize batteries to serve something day ahead and then realize that action intraday. And that battery dispatch schedule is of course based on a battery's state of charge in each interval. If you stop receiving measurements from the resource, or you suddenly start receiving measurements from the resource some number of intervals after you expect to be receiving them, your ability to dispatch that resource reliably falls away. And thus your ability to rely on that resource to provide a service falls away, because you can't necessarily know that it's there to charge in the event that there's excess solar, and in that case reduce the voltage issue that the solar would have caused in your system without the battery. Yep, I think someone just said something, but and so it's for us, as a company that wants to show that you can take advanced planning to operation safely, it's crucial to have those communication systems be live and reliable, because without them, your situational awareness kind of falls away, and you just have to guess and hope that the battery that said it was available is available.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Actually, reacting to Ben's comment here, I think this is crucial not only for storage dispatch, but even for your regular demand response capability when you're thinking of optimizing across different types of source fuel. So for a building that is providing cooling and is monitoring temperatures in real time, and that would get complaints from tenants on not meeting the appropriate window for the temperature constraints, and has to make an on-the-fly decision between yielding electric or steam or reducing the set points on that equipment, you need the real-time data. And this expands beyond just the electrical metering, monitoring, 15-minute level, let's say, that AMI could provide initially.
Yeah, and another point on this is, you open up like a manipulation can of worms. If your best level of metering is 15 minutes, but your dispatch needs to be like 5 minutes or like, every second, like the question is, well, if they're only metered every 15 minutes or the measurement only comes in like every minute, but I'm expecting dispatch every 15 seconds or some such, what were they doing in between that time? Were they just not doing the action I expected of them? Was that potentially increasing or decreasing prices, beyond something just and reasonable? Is that a manipulation case on its own? Or is that just a case of the data doesn't let you know? And so those are like, long-term considerations, but to the point that Dave and Stephen were bringing up, those data do need to exist, and they need to exist reliably. And a lot of our engagements, I think, in industry at this point are showing the next steps would be much better if these data could exist reliably.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to add something to this here. A lot of vendors can provide this data. I think the issue is more regulatory than anything else, for measurement and verification, that you have to get the metering data versus what the data, that I would say, multiple kind of demand response providers can provide you with, what measurement and verification they do with their own customers. I think it's kind of the regulatory nature of it, I think, is prohibitive. This process.
Yeah, and we've seen that in some other jurisdictions where, for example, only current is able to be displayed, but voltage is not. And then, well, if you can only get one of the two, you can't really do the settlement that you would expect to do for some of these programs. So, you say, well, that's just a law that has to change, not necessarily a software or hardware system. Well, the law has to change. The hardware system doesn't necessarily have to change, then the software will change.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of power quality data that we can get from inverters, but we're just not using it, for instance. So they're quite nuanced. This way. Ben, I'm gonna stick with you, so I'm gonna combine a little bit of some of the questions that have come. Is there kind of correlation between maximizing DR value and increasing hosting capacity, or do those two things not align?
So increasing hosting capacity is generally defined as allowing more DER to join the grid at the same time, right? So you'd say a bunch more solar, or a bunch more EV chargers, or a bunch more batteries. And then increasing the value of a resource would basically be, well, the resource could potentially do 1,000 kilowatt hours over the year, but it's restricted to 500 kilowatt hours or something like that. I think that they are tied together. The idea essentially being that dynamic control of the resource probably lets you have more of the resource. I know that there's some use case from, I want to say it was Germany, where the idea was basically that if you uprated the solar that was installed on the rooftop and you had smart controls for that solar resource, it would output more energy over the course of the day. And you would just be curtailing it from its peak output at the like 2 to 4 p.m. hour, for example. But you'd be getting a much higher amount of output out of that resource in the, let's say, 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. hours, right? And that's just a simple control on the resource to basically curtail it in its highest output hours based on like the voltage at that resource. So I think that they are related. Like you can certainly increase hosting capacity and increase value increase the revenue that the resource can be paid. Yeah, I'd say that they're definitely related, and it's a matter of what people are able to say is safe, and the determination on safe comes down to not just the planning study, but the pilot project that shows that operation is feasible and scalable. Right? Just having it on one circuit, it really isn't anyone's goal. The idea is it has to be able to be scaled throughout entire utilities.
Yeah, I agree. And that's actually a nice segue into kind of the support of wide scale adoption of DERs, and also kind of aligning the value for customers, but also for utilities. So Maybe, David, I can kick this to you as a kind of some supporting policies that you've seen for adoption of DERs that you think, speak well to kind of setting a foundation for scaling, or, what you would like to see as well.
Yeah, so some of the key elements around metering are definitely part of the type of policy that will enable more DER adoption. So clear guidance on the types of upgrades will be required and how the costs will be distributed is necessary. The decarbonization efforts I've already mentioned, Local 987, there was a full panel on this, but that is definitely spurring a lot of activity in the real estate sector, moving towards incorporating DERs as part of their strategy for meeting and avoiding penalties. Having more dynamic price signals within the utility retail space is definitely going to shift us towards an opportunity to optimize resources in closer to real time as what we've done up to this point, which has been primarily around targeted dispatch time periods with fixed compensation, that might not really extract the full value of the DER. So in reality, it's all about trying to shift the existing paradigm of getting as much capacity as possible with a simple set of rules to a set of rules that allows for clear forecasting of market revenues so that the investments happen, but that extract as much of the value that the DER could provide as possible. That is really the shift that we need to see happen in the industry.
Great. All right, we got a couple minutes here left, so I'm going to do a go around. Steven, I'm going to start with you. If you were sitting here 1 year from now, what achievement would you want to be talking about?
Yeah, sure. If fast forward a year from now, one achievement that I'd like to see is, again, I like to look at things sort of at the macro level. So I'd like to see that, the U.S. gets back into the Paris Climate Accord. I'd like to see the U.S. get back into really being a global steward for reduction of greenhouse gases, addressing climate change. And at the same time, here locally in the U.S., I'd like to see a deliberate approach by the new administration to really tackle head on some of the major issues that we have as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions, not only from the electric sector, but transportation as well. And that can look like a number of things. That could be federal grants to accelerate some of this technology adoption, federal grants to solve some of the really difficult, complex problems as it relates to being able to integrate more DER and have them operate in harmony with traditional utility assets. So that's what I'd like to see in about a year from now.
Yeah, I'm excited for the EV infrastructure that's been clearly laid out as part of Biden's plan. So definitely with you on that. Ben, any thoughts here on what you want to see a year from now?
Can I compress like 6 years into 1 year? Sure. Compressing 6 years into 1 year, what I'd like to see is Order 2222 turned into a full TSO-DSO coordination, where instead of just bypassing the distribution system, the resources are fully considered. So if it's what I want to see in a year, I'd like to see that the FERC and distribution utility coordination that took place is one that enables the DER to take part in bulk markets for sure, because that's what 2222 mandates, but do so in a way that considers their possible benefit to the states and the distribution utilities, so that the markets can, march further toward the path of integration. Because in the end, it's just an energy service. It's just a megawatt up or a megawatt down. And the goal is to do it reliably, cheaply, and, as Stephen was stating, now cleanly again. And so with that goal in mind, coordinating across that value stream from bulk to distribution is what I'd like to see next year.
Yeah, I looked at that for my PhD.
Yeah.
Really 10, so I'm excited to see it materialize both here and in Europe. David, last thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Running on the hour here, so quick compliment a lot of what Ben and Steve have already mentioned, but from the building perspective, what I really want to see is real estate investment trust, family-owned portfolios shifting into making commitments on decarbonization for real-time energy use. That would be, I think, a huge move that large tech companies are already doing. But I think we need it in commercial buildings. That's really what I want to see happen in New York City and in the US.
Yeah, definitely those big load centers. Well, this is it from us. Do our organizers want to say some final thoughts here? From my end, my presentation will be sent around, so I'll let the organizers distribute that.
I just thank you once again, everybody, for coming. Again, this has been a pleasure bringing you this event. As a joint venture, I guess, between YPE and DER Task Force. Please feel free to reach out to any of us. I think we've added all of our links to the chat. My name is Leo Trudell, by the way. I'm the president of YPE, so feel free to reach out to me personally. And everybody have a great night. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Happy holidays.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.